Hello, everyone. My name is Fiona Marks, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Vedic Astrology podcast. I'm a Vedic astrologer. I'm a graduate of the Asheville Vedic Astrology Apprenticeship Program. I'm the host of Astrolojam, a monthly get-together of astrologers geeking out over a pre-researched chart. And I'm a tutor on the Vedic-Astrology course at teachable.com. The Vedic Astrology podcast has 5 topic areas. Number 1, what is Vedic astrology? Number 2, how does astrology work? 3, examining the knowledge and techniques of Vedic astrology. 4, interviewing Vedic astrologers and finding out all about their fascinations and insights into Vedic astrology. And the final topic area of the Vedic Astrology podcast is case studies, where we see the application of Vedic astrology in a person's chart. In the case today, I want to talk to you about and explore with you how we see Vedic astrology playing out on a planetary level. This is a case study episode, not of a person's chart, but of the Earth itself. Today I'm going to be talking about the Sun, about Ayana Bala, Chesta Bala, and the exploitation of the hemispheres of this planet. It's going to be a wide-ranging podcast today. First, we will revisit some of the things we covered in our first podcast called What is Vedic Astrology? We're going to return to the idea of the ecliptic and refresh our knowledge and look at how the sun moves through the ecliptic from our perspective. That cyclical up and down movement that the sun makes in our sky during the year, how it is higher in the sky in summer and lower in the sky in winter. Second, we're going to look at how we measure Ayana Bala and Chesta Bala for the sun in Vedic astrology. Then we're going to look at some of the experiential differences between the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere. And finally, the case study we're going to examine is how this plays out globally. Do we see on a global backdrop of geopolitics the kind of behavior that Vedic astrology is implying in Ayana Bala and the Sun's Chesta Bala? So stick with me in this episode, as I know that we're now taking a deep dive into a specific area of Vedic astrology. You may not have heard of Chesta Bala or Ayana Bala before, or even of Shadbala, but stick with me as I'm going to try and bring us all along for the ride, and I hope to make it an interesting and thought-provoking podcast. Let's begin by remembering in episode 1 of the podcast, I spent quite some time talking about the importance of the ecliptic. Perhaps I even labored on that topic. And you will recall that the ecliptic is that stable reference points that humans found and we were able to use as a stationary reference point in a moving universe. And I also took some time explaining that the Zodiac constellations were segment names of this ecliptic and that the Zodiac itself was not seasonal. And I did that because it's easy for us to think that the Zodiac is seasonal. It seems to map the movement of the sun higher in the sky during the Northern Hemisphere summer. So it can be easy to think that Aries is the start of spring, and for that reason to think that Zodiac is seasonal. But the sun, from the Earth's perspective, is moving its way up and down this north-south axis along the Earth. And it's really important for what we're going to talk about today. And this highlights the importance of explaining concepts correctly from the beginning, even when it seems to make things a little more complicated. And I smile as I tell you this because here at home, every Saturday, we make what I call pancakes, Saturday morning pancakes. I've always told my daughter that we're making pancakes. But in fact, I actually make pikelets. I'm Australian, and pikelets were popular when I was growing up. And they're like small pancakes. They're thicker, and apparently they're halfway between a pancake and a crumpet. And I've always enjoyed pikelets rather than pancakes. And I just lazily use the generic term pancakes to describe them because they have the same ingredients and they use the same cooking process. But of course, what happens is that my child growing up learning that what we eat is a pancake, a tiny little pikelet thing. And so I'm smiling because if I were to just take the time to use the right words from the beginning, then we wouldn't end up in disputes over what's a pancake and what's a pikelet. And that's also why it's important to do all that we did in the first episode about the ecliptic and how the zodiac are segments of that ecliptic and not a seasonal motion of the sun. Let's get back to astrology. We're going to begin by manipulating the zodiac in our minds. And here we're going to do that in 2 stages. So first, in your mind's eye, I want you to visualize the zodiac. You might see it as the ecliptic in space. You might see it as a circle if you're familiar with Western astrology. Or perhaps if you use the South Indian chart, you can see the zodiac in your mind's eye as a square. Whichever way you visualize it, I want you to rotate that zodiac so that Cancer is at the top and Capricorn is at the bottom. And then to imagine that you're pulling that chart by its solstices. That is, that you imagine you are grabbing hold of Cancer and you're grabbing hold of Capricorn, and I want you to pull those 2 solstices away from each other, lengthening out the chart. If it was an elastic band, you're taking it from its round shape and making it in vertically longer by pulling the opposite ends away from each other. One end up, the other end down and away. Eventually, in our visualization today, we'll get to a totally skinny chart. But on the way there, in this first stage of today's manipulation of the zodiac, let's pause at a milestone along the way called a polarity chart, or the chakra planet correspondence chart. As you pull these solstices apart, Cancer to the north and Capricorn to the south, you'll notice that the masculine and feminine signs become attracted to each other. The negative and positive polarities attract. And in this first stage, we end up with Cancer and Leo at the top and Capricorn Aquarius at the bottom. You can see how these polarities attract each other. That is, Cancer being feminine, Leo being masculine. Gemini and Virgo, Gemini being masculine, Virgo being feminine, attracted to each other. Then Taurus and Libra, Taurus being feminine, Libra being masculine, they're attracted to each other, and so on. And there are many beautiful insights in this polarity or chakra planet correspondence chart. We see the sun and the moon at the top of the chart, the moon ruling Cancer, sun ruling Leo, and it shows neatly that idea that the whole zodiac belongs to the sun and the moon, how they delegate to the other planets, the other signs, and make them deputies. But the moon rules or has connection with all the feminine energy in the zodiac, and the sun has a connection with all the masculine signs in the chart. It demonstrates a double helix, figure 8 infinity shape that you see in DNA. You see those figure 8 lines crossing over each other in this polarity chart. We see how the masculine and feminine polarities are balanced and attract each other throughout the chart. And you can follow the sign ownership down the chart. When you have Cancer and Leo at the top, under that you have Gemini and Virgo, both ruled by Mercury, Taurus and Libra together, both ruled by Venus, Aries and Scorpio, both ruled by Mars, Pisces and Sagittarius, both ruled by Jupiter, and at the bottom we see Saturn ruling both Aquarius and Capricorn. So we see how beautifully this chart displays many of the interconnected polarities and balances in the chart. If we want to, we can also see the chakras in this chart as well. Starting at the bottom, there with Saturn, we can think about that as the first chakra, the root chakra, working all the way up through Jupiter, second, Mars, third, all the way up to the 6th chakra with Sun and Moon at the top, each chakra having a female and male quality, each chakra having a negative and positive polarity. So this is a neat way to display the zodiac chart, and perhaps a podcast episode all in its own right for another day. For today's discussion, let's keep moving to stage 2 of our manipulation of the zodiac. Having taken a pit stop to explore the neat polarity chart, now I want to ask you to keep pulling the solstices away until we really do have Cancer. That is the beginning of Cancer, the 21st of June at the top, and we have Capricorn solstice, the 21st December, right at the bottom. We have pulled Cancer to the north and Capricorn to the south. We can see that the sun goes through each of these zodiac signs or each of these segments of the ecliptic. It's moving from the north to the south and then from the south up to the north again. Interestingly, if you remember from episode 1, when the sun does this from our perspective, it makes a figure 8 in its annual journey, and we call that an analyse, which repeats the DNA double helix figure 8 pattern that we noticed in the polarity chart. Back to this solstice chart that we've just made. When it's summer in the northern hemisphere, the sun is in the north, and summer in the southern hemisphere is when the sun is in the south. Equally, winter in the northern hemisphere is when the sun is in the south, and winter in the southern hemisphere is when the sun is in the north. Okay, now I'm asking you to visualize Cancer at the very top, Capricorn at the very bottom, and that the sun moves along the ecliptic, and we can trace summer and winter in either hemisphere based on this north and south movement that the sun is doing. This is important because in Vedic astrology, we use this north-south journey for various calculations. Today, we are interested in it because this north-south journey is used to calculate Ayana Bala and for something about Chesta Bala. But before we get into the detail of Ayana Bala and Chesta Bala, let's examine briefly what these balas are all about. What is Shadbala? Shadbala is a way of quantifying the potency of a planet. It shows us how powerful a planet is. Does the planet have enough power to achieve its agenda? This quantification of potency is made up of 6 strengths, or Shadbalas. They are number 1, positional strength. This is called Sthana Bala, and it comes from where the planet is positioned in the chart. Number 2 is directional strength, based on the cardinal directions, north, south, east, west. We call that Digbala, and it helps the person to hear the planet in their chart. Then there is temporal strength, which we call Kala Bala. It is based on how many times the planet is in the corresponding day or year or month, etc. of those time calculations. Then the 4th strength is declinational strength. That's Ayana Bala. It's the focus of today's episode, and it's about how far the planet is from the Earth's equator in terms of the ecliptic. The 5th strength is motional strength, called Chesta Bala. It's generally about how fast the planet is moving. And then finally we have Digbala, which is aspectual strength, whether the planet is receiving aspects from other helpful planets or whether it's getting sabotaged by unhelpful aspects from malefic planets. As a side note, I love Digbala, and I hope we get to have a podcast episode all about that. To summarize, we've got positional strength, directional strength, temporal strength, declinational strength, motional strength, and aspectual strength. These are the 6 strengths, and you can see that the strengths tell us a lot about the placement of the planet. They're in a way more astronomical than the dignities, because the dignities are based on friends and signs, which is more relationship based, whereas Shadbala is largely based on the position that the planet is in. It's more measurable in a mathematical, astronomical way. And Shadbala is not about conjunctions in the way that Lajatariya Vashtas, nor the prosperity and house annihilation systems are. So that's one way to think about Shadbala. It's a bit more astronomical or mathematical about the placement of the planet. And your astrology software is going to calculate all of these things. However, if you want to learn how to do it yourself, you can sign up on teachable.com to the Asheville Vedic Astrology Apprenticeship Program that's loaded up there now under Vedic-Astrology. And there is a whole semester devoted to Shadbala. And we go through each one of the balas. We look at the formulas for calculating Sthana Bala, Dig Bala, Chesta Bala, etc., so that you can understand really where the potency is coming from for each planet in each unique horoscope. Then you can see where can a planet draw its power from. If it's in a good placement, it's going to have its own strength to draw upon. But if it's in a weaker situation, it just can't gather up that strength that it needs to achieve its agenda, and it needs to call on support from its friends. I'll put a link to the course in the show notes, the description and the transcript. Shadbala is an important part of understanding how a planet is going to perform in everyone's chart. And for the purposes of our podcast today, we're interested in 2 out of these 6 balas. We want to talk about number 4, declinational strength, and number 5, motional strength, or number 4, Ayana Bala, and number 5, Chesta Bala. Ayana Bala is based solely on that skinny vertical solstice chart that you and I just created in our minds. Ayana Bala says that certain planets get declinational strength when they are north of the equator, and others get declinational strength when they are south of the equator. This aligns with Vedic mythology, where the north is the realm of the gods and the south is the realm of the demons. Ayana Bala tells us how each planet will perform during conflict or in adversity. Some planets are going to do better in the north, where when it comes to times of conflict and adversity, they're in the realm of ideals and values. It's the godly realm. In the south, the rubber hits the road, and the planets that do well in the south are those that are able to deal with the real world and to adapt, to take the real world as it is. Let's see which planets do well in the north of the ecliptic and which of them do well in the south. Think of the space between Aries and Virgo. That is Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo. That is the northern half of the ecliptic. The sun does well in the north, where it is a beacon of inspiration. It's like that lighthouse. It guides us. It's inspirational, something that we can aspire to. It pulls us up. If we're ever lost, we look at the lighthouse. We know our direction. The sun does well in the north of the ecliptic. Mars also does well in the north of the ecliptic because Mars works best on ideals, a warrior fighting for Dharma, for what is right. Mars has a strong sense of idealism and of right and wrong. Jupiter also does well in the north of the ecliptic because its great contribution is seeing the big picture. When we go through conflict, when we go through adversity, if we can understand the enormity of all the context of life, suddenly adversity and conflict falls into place, and we understand why sometimes these things happen. Jupiter needs to see the big picture. It works better in the north. And finally, Venus also works best in the north for Ayana Bala because Venus is all about leading us to higher fulfillment. That is its mission. And it needs to be in that northerly space to see those higher values and that higher fulfillment. So we have the Sun, Mars, Jupiter and Venus doing well in Ayana Bala in the northern half of the ecliptic. That is from the equator to the Tropic of Cancer and back to the equator. That leaves us with planets that do well in the south. That is from Libra to Pisces. Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, Pisces. The planets that do well in the south are the moon, because the moon's great strength is its adaptability. It doesn't actually do well if it gets stuck in ideals. It's watery, it's flowing, it smooths things out. It provides that ability to adapt to adversity, to conflict, and to respond appropriately. If it's in the north, it gets stuck in ideals, trying to impose ideals from the personality or from the egoic perspective. Those ideals do much better in the south, where they can adapt. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. It can adapt to the conditions and be effective. So the moon does well in the southern part of the ecliptic. And Saturn also does well in the southern part of the ecliptic because it is a planet of reality. It expects life to be real. Saturn does not expect life to be idealistic in any way, so it's ready to deal with the world as it is, which is what life is like in the south. If we take the mythology of the world of the gods and the world of the demons, Saturn is like, okay, well, I was expecting it to be rough, so that's fine, that's normal. Saturn doesn't waste energy on thinking that it should have been fair or it should have been righteous. Sun, Mars, Jupiter and Venus do well in the north. Moon and Saturn do well in the south. And when we zoom out, now that we know a little bit more about Ayana Bala, we notice there are 4 planets doing well in the north of the equator, from the equator to the Tropic of Cancer and back again, and only 2 planets doing well from the equator to the Tropic of Capricorn and back again. There's an imbalance. More planets do well in the north, less planets do well in the south. In fact, it's double, 4 to 2. 4 do well in the north, only 2 do well in the south. We're not mentioning Mercury here because Mercury does well everywhere in Ayana Bala. It gets half points at the equator and increases its strength the further away it gets from the equator. So it's strongest at the solstices, but even at the equinoxes, it never gets lower than 50% of Ayana Bala. So mostly we're leaving Mercury to one side for today's case studies. Therefore, we've got 4 planets doing well in the north and 2 planets doing well in the south. Having examined Ayana Bala, let's now go pick up Chesta Bala as well, because these are the 2 balas that we need to examine for today's case study. Chesta Bala is motional strength. It recognizes that the slower a planet is moving, the more confidently or the more brightly it can achieve its agenda. When we look at the sky, it's when the planets slow down or even when they're going retrograde that they become brighter. Chesta Bala likes retrograde planets. They provide more brightness and more confidence to the planet. That might be a little bit out of step with things that you've heard about retrograde if you follow astrology in glossy magazines or on your newsfeed. If you're anything like me, your news app will be always sending you articles about how Mercury retrograde is going to mess with you over the coming weeks. It's not seen that way in Vedic astrology, however. In Vedic astrology, we think that retrograde gives the planet more confidence in achieving its agenda. It's taking its time, it's got the time to execute what it needs to achieve, and even the time to go over its work, review it, and improve it. It's not whizzing on by, flustered and in a rush. Chesta Bala can only be measured for planets that orbit the Sun. For this reason, the Chesta Bala of the Sun and the Moon are calculated differently than all the other planets. For today's podcast, we're focused on the Sun, so let's look at how Chesta Bala is measured for the Sun. The Sun doesn't change speed in the same way as other planets because it's the center of our solar system. We are all spinning around it. So the convention for the Sun is that in Chesta Bala, we use the Sun's Ayana Bala score. This is important because we've already noticed the stacking of Ayana Bala with planets in the north, right? And now, not only that, but we have the Sun also getting strong Chesta Bala when it's in the north. We're really seeing a bit of a focus here, a bit of weighting of more planets being attributed to the northern part of the ecliptic. And for someone who was born in the southern hemisphere, my ears pricked up when I learned this in Vedic astrology. Because basically what we're saying in Vedic astrology is that if someone is born on the longest day of the year in the southern hemisphere, that is the day with the most sunlight all year, then the Sun in their chart will receive low Chesta Bala. And someone born on the shortest, dimmest, coldest day of the year in the southern hemisphere is going to get high Chesta Bala Sun, even though the Sun was only up for a short period of that day. That doesn't sound right, does it? It puts front and center that in Vedic astrology, the sun's light, when it's stimulating the Earth's southern hemisphere, is less confident, less pure, less righteous, even if it's bright, high in the sky, and been up for long, long hours of daylight on that day. Because of this contrast between my default perception, sun high, sun bright, therefore should be high Chesta Bala, versus Vedic astrology, sun south, not bright, low Chesta Bala, I've always wondered, how could you do any research to prove or disprove this? It's one of those things that I'm sure if you're listening and you were born in the Southern Hemisphere, it's just one of those things that you think about because experientially it's counterintuitive. And I've thought about research that I could do. Could I find celebrities born on the northern solstice and born on the southern solstice and compare their inverted commas brightness or their inverted commas inspiringness or confidence? Would that help? How could I make that extensive enough? And as an aside for this podcast, I did ask the internet for political leaders born on the 21st of December and for those born on the 21st of June. Disturbingly, maybe, there are more political leaders born on the 21st of December than on the 21st of June. So that straw poll might tell us that to make it in politics, a person needs some deal making and some compromising, perhaps. An equally quick internet search of spiritual leaders also brings up more born on 21st of December than on 21st of June. Perhaps we're now scratching our heads, but maybe we could say that this is a lot more about the sun being in Capricorn and hard work, or the way that one has to work with reality on a planet like this. This is a research project that needs more defining and more planning. Meanwhile, back to my dilemma of designing an experiment. It's counterintuitive that the longest day of the sun would produce low Chesta Bala. But can I prove if it's right or wrong? What can I do? So imagine my interest when the following article came across my newsfeed. Rich countries drained $152 trillion from the global south since 1960. This article is an opinion piece from the Al Jazeera website, and it's written by academics from the UK, Australia, and Pakistan. They estimate that the global north drains $2.2 trillion from the global south every year. Apparently, that is enough money to end poverty globally 15 times over. The wealth that the north takes from the south has outstripped the rate of economic growth, which means that those figures of growth that we see the economy growing in the northern countries is actually coming more from taking resources from the south than from increased efficiency or production in the north. And the losses the south experience far outstrip foreign aid transfers to the tune of losing $14 for every $1 of foreign aid. The article explains that there are many factors involved in this. There's lower wages in the global south. There is the makeup of international regulatory bodies like the World Bank and the IMF, which are overwhelmingly comprised of leaders from the global north rather than the global south. And we also have resources and mineral distribution, perhaps being more in the south than in the north. I thought this article was super interesting. I'll include it in the show notes and the transcript, and I really encourage you to read it in full. I can't do justice to it in a couple of minutes on the podcast, so I hope you'll go ahead and read it. you can see how this poses an interesting contribution to my research about whether the way Vedic astrology measures Chesta Bala and Ayana Bala is correct. Let's revisit what low Chesta Bala sun really means. When the sun is in the south, it's going to have low Chesta Bala. That is, it's going to lack the confidence to be bold, to stand at the front and to take a beating, to stand up for what it believes in. It will falter in following its path and in taking care of others, and it won't be able to shine or be a beacon of inspiration to others. When we reflect on those qualities of low Chesta Bala sun, do you see that this is the case in the leadership of those countries? Because leadership is a quality of the sun. And are leaders in the south lacking a presence in global leadership? And that's what this article points out. The disparity in the makeup of international monetary regulatory bodies and policy bodies. So the article does seem to be having some bearing on noticing what's happening with the sun's low Chesta Bala. And what about Ayana Bala? We know that the sun's Chesta Bala is entirely based on its Ayana Bala. What are the qualities of a low sun Ayana Bala? The person tends to be a bit more selfish. Perhaps they're willing to do whatever it takes to accomplish their goal, which could even end up hurting other people. And they can change their principles. Circumstances can force them to change sides. This is in contrast to the noble behavior that we see in conflict of the sun when it's high in Ayana Bala, that is, when it's in the north. And doesn't this describe well the disconnect? If we think back to history, to the age of enlightenment in Europe, that is in the north, where there were all these principles and high ideals, but at exactly the same time, those same cultures were colonizing and exploiting the southern hemisphere. Now, I have to acknowledge that, unfortunately, humans exploit humans everywhere. I'm not trying to say that Europeans didn't exploit their own citizens as well, because that happened, or that cultures in the southern hemisphere didn't have ideas or high philosophies. The world is a very rich place, and I don't want to oversimplify it down too much. But at the same time, if we want to examine if the southern part of the ecliptic, that is from Libra all the way through to Pisces, is imparting different qualities to the sun, this article provides us with some interesting perspective. And if these two hemispheres of the ecliptic are so important to Ayana Bala, we do want to see something at a global scale. So I'm very interested in what the article is contributing to the conversation. Let's take a look at how the other planets perform well in the northern part of the ecliptic. We've got Mars doing well. It's righteous in conflict when it's in the north, whereas in the south, it can get involved in conflict just for conflict's sake. It doesn't have the grounding in the principles and idealism of the north, of the realm of the heavens. Jupiter does well in the north because it's able to see the big picture. This makes conflicts worth it when it's in the north. It really brings the discussion that is the Bhagavad Gita between Krishna and Arjuna to mind. Krishna explaining why we go through something, what is about to take place in this story of the Mahabharata at this point. And it shows that Jupiter can learn from conflict. Just think about how that text has taught so many of us for so long, for so many generations. Whereas in the south, Jupiter gets lost in the detail of conflict. He becomes overwhelmed by the reality of conflict and he can't find purpose. He just can't learn from the conflict. He's bogged down and overwhelmed. And Venus does well in the north because when she's there, she knows what is worth fighting for. The property of Venus that is leading us to higher fulfillment. It works well in the north and it helps us pick which conflicts are worth it. Venus in the north also has a sense of higher humanity, that we all have to participate together so we can get as much as we can in a peaceful way. Whereas when she's in the south, she can't evaluate which conflicts are worth the suffering. Also, Venus can't use any of her diplomacy in the south because everybody in this world of demons, where the reality of conflict is that people are hurt at the time and they can't be reasoned with and they can't be reasonable. Diplomacy doesn't work when everything is so raw and traumatized. That's an examination of the planets that are doing well in the north. And if it's the case that the Chesta Bala of the Sun, the bold, pure, inspiring leadership ability of the southern hemisphere is weak, how is the south supposed to address this adversity when Ayana Bala stacked that double the amount of planets do well in the north? In the south, what are we to do if it is the case that the southern hemisphere or the global south is being exploited by the north? How will that balance ever be redressed when we have all these planets that are only doing well when they're in the north? In the south, only the Moon and Saturn perform well in adversity. That is the fastest moving planet and the slowest moving planet. The Moon is doing well because she's naturally adaptable. She won't be stiff and rigid and imposing her ideals on reality. She'll be finding a way to smooth things, to make things flow. And Saturn does well because it has the power to endure. It's a planet of reality, so it doesn't expect ideals. It's expecting life to be tough. How can planets in the global south prevent this exploitation from the global north? Can this exploitation be changed without ideals? Are the Moon and Saturn going to have the kind of potency to make a change here without the northern planets? Australia and New Zealand, interestingly, are not counted in the global south generally, and that is because they usually have higher wages than the rest of the global south. They also have some membership of regulatory bodies. Although, in my opinion, I think that the exploitation of minerals from Australia and the way that is achieved in the treatment of native or traditional owners of the land, for me, I would argue that that fits the trend of the global north exploiting the global south. It's interesting at the moment, if you follow the news, to see how both Australia and New Zealand are dealing with China. As China experiments with taking land and territory in the South Pacific, how is the nation of China in the Northern Hemisphere treating the South, that Southern Pacific region? Australia is using arguments that it thinks are principled and virtuous, but it's not being taken seriously by China. Australia is trying to make a stand about these things, but it's a small country compared to China, and China belittles Australia's attempt to be principled. So it's quite interesting in the context of this Chesta Bala, Ayana Bala conversation. Where are those leaders in the South that have strong suns and inspire global change? Maybe a case study for another podcast is Jacinda Ardern, who is the current New Zealand Prime Minister, because she has managed to inspire people even in the Northern Hemisphere. However, in general, I would say by trend that leaders in the Southern Hemisphere aren't taken as seriously as leaders in the Northern Hemisphere. I wonder, wherever you are in the world, is the northern part of wherever you are richer than the southern part? Can you see this pattern wherever it is that you live? Is it something that happens universally? Is the northern part of the US richer than the southern part? Is the northern part of Portugal richer than the south? Are Northern Europeans richer or more principled than Southern Europeans? And if so, does that wealth come from historical exploitation? It's really interesting to think about how the Sun's Chesta Bala and the Ayana Bala of all the planets are affecting humanity globally across these different hemispheres. Now, where does this leave us with our northern and southern portions of the ecliptic? Is astrology and astronomy providing us with an explanation of the north-south exploitation? What do you think? Is the sun in the south having a global impact? If we go back to the chakra planet correspondence chart, is the sun in the southern ecliptic really stimulating the base chakra and the sun in the northern ecliptic really stimulating our sixth chakra of higher ideals. Could that be an explanation for what's happening? Do you agree with that? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And then the question comes, is this something that we should be living in harmony with, or is it something to fight against? When you think about the way minerals are distributed across the planet, is it by design that because of this, the South is supposed to be exploited? Remember, when the sun is, in inverted commas, in the north from our perspective, the Earth is really bowing to the sun or below the sun. That is why the sun can shine onto the top of the northern part of the planet. When the sun is, in inverted commas, in the south from our perspective, the Earth is really above the sun. That is, the sun is beaming up from under. The southern part of the Earth, therefore, must be above the sun a little there. And is this the mixing up of the natural order of things? Is it the case that the sun is supposed to be above the Earth and shining down onto the north of the planet? What do you think? Could that possibly be the case? And what does this mean for your own chart? In which hemisphere was the sun when you were born? And how do you find that that affects your ability to stand strong in your vision and to be a beacon and to protect others? That's your Sun Chesta Bala. And how do you find the balance of Ayana Bala potency in your chart? Where are all your planets in relation to the north and south of the ecliptic? If you were born in the southern hemisphere, how do you feel about the sun getting high Chesta Bala in winter and low Chesta Bala in summer? If I had a standpoint, I'm naturally against the idea because it's just so counterintuitive from an experiential point of view, that on the shortest and coldest, dimmest day of the year, the sun would actually get strong Chesta Bala. We have to keep in mind the significant experiential differences and changes when one is in the northern and the southern hemisphere. For example, did you know that the waxing moon in the northern hemisphere looks like a D, and the waxing moon in the southern hemisphere on the same night looks like a C? That is, they curve in opposite directions. The moon shape, the shape of the crescent, goes in a curve that is exactly opposite of each other on the same night. They are upside down to each other because in the northern hemisphere, we look south to see the ecliptic. In the southern hemisphere, we look north to see the ecliptic. There are significant differences, like the shape of the moon is opposite to each other every night of the year. And this applies to all the other constellations and planets. If you are in the northern hemisphere, you look south to see them. If you're in the southern hemisphere, you look north to see them. And therefore, they look, inverted commas, upside down compared to the view from the northern hemisphere. Saturn looks upside down, all of the constellations, all the planets, we're looking at them from this different perspective. So obviously the experience of seeing the night sky is different whether you are in the northern or southern hemisphere. We've talked about how counterintuitive it is for someone that lives in the southern hemisphere to think of strong Chesta Bala on the 21st of June for the sun because it's such a short, cold, dim day. But I have to say, I have found this article that we've discussed today to be a really valuable contribution to the data around the power of the north and the southern portions of the ecliptic. I find it really thought-provoking, and I wonder what you think and how this enriches your perspective of Ayana Bala and Chesta Bala, of the balance of power between the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. I am looking forward to your thoughts on how this inspires your thinking and informs the way that you apply Shadbala and specifically these Balas to the charts that you research. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with me here today as we have examined the Sun, Ayana Bala, Chesta Bala, and the exploitation of the hemispheres. I look forward to hearing all of your thoughts and also to being with you again on the next episode of the Vedic Astrology podcast. I hope you will join me. Until then, best wishes and stay well.